Okay, so part two, we're going to take a closer look at The End of the Transition Paradigm by Thomas Carothers. So this is one you might want to go take a look at it, give it a print off, and make some notes while we're going through it. I'll be pointing out maybe some key quotes, some key ideas in here as we go along. So the real impetus for writing this was this idea, we saw the third wave that Huntington was talking about, that there's just an explosion of countries becoming democratic. We see all these waves of transition from authoritarian rule, and we get excited and we say, okay, everybody who is a dictatorship, eventually they're going to move and become a democracy, and it's just a matter of time. And slowly we'll get this transition from dictatorship to democracy, and all will be well in the world. So that's kind of the impetus of writing this article, because Carothers says, but what about all the places where democratization has stalled? That there's just really no inevitability for democracy anymore. So why do we see all these countries where we thought they were moving towards democracy and then they just kind of stopped? And they're not really a democracy, they're not really a dictatorship. We talked a little bit last class about hybrid regimes, and they just seem to be stuck in transition. So why do we seem to think that there's this idea that everyone's going to eventually democratize? And he says, well, a lot of it has to do with some of the core assumptions that we believe about democratization that might not actually be true. So the first one, he goes through 5 different core assumptions. And the first one is right here, is that we assume that moving away from dictatorship means moving towards democracy. And we have this idea that, if a dictatorship falls, that naturally democracy is going to come to take its place. And Carothers says, maybe not, but he'll kind of go through and refute each of these core assumptions a little bit later in the article. So I'll just hold off from doing that now. We'll just go through the key assumptions. So number 1, if you're leaving dictatorship, you're automatically going to democracy. The next one is this idea that democratization is going to happen in some nice, neat steps. You get an opening, some sort of period where there are some cracks in the dictatorial regime, and then there's some sort of breakthrough in this rapid emergence of democracy, and then you consolidate democracy, or consolidation meaning you kind of stabilize it, and that democratization is going to always take place in these 3 steps. So we assume that as well. And again, Carothers later is going to say, maybe not. The third is that elections are super important. And when you have an election, eventually you're going to get a democracy. So think back to a couple weeks ago, or maybe last week. Last week when we talked about defining a democracy. Elections are pretty key. And so there's this, traditional idea that elections will lead to democracy. The idea is that that political actors will develop, the citizenry is going to develop, civil liberties are going to solidify, and that elections are just inevitably going to lead to democracy. We call that democratic lock-in. That once you have an election, citizens are going to get used to being able to have a say, and really it'll be hard to move back towards an authoritarian regime again. But again, Carothers isn't so sure. The next one is this idea that democratization is universal. Let's just find the, right here. Yeah. That it doesn't really matter what level of economic development you have, what kind of culture you have, that democracy is going to happen regardless. It's just a matter of time, and that every society, just based on the fact that they're humans, are going to eventually want some say in rule, and therefore you're going to get democracy. The 5th is this idea right here that democracy will lead to a functioning state. That it's simple. You just become a democracy, and all of a sudden, all of your issues with economic development, all your issues with inequality are just going to disappear. And it's kind of the sense that democracy will solve all problems. So these are these 5 assumptions that we tend to make about democratization, and as you can guess, Carothers is going to smash them. So here's how he starts this off. So he says, okay, The problem is that we've seen that transition has stalled in actually most cases. Very few cases actually cleanly, easily move from dictatorship to democracy. And in some cases, these attempts at transitions to democracy have actually reverted back to authoritarianism. But in most cases, they just kind of remain in this transition. They're not fully democracy and they're not fully a dictatorship. They're what we would call a hybrid regime. And so what you'll get in these sorts of regimes, he explains down here, that there's, some sort of semi-functioning-ish democracy, but there's going to be poor representation of citizen interests, low levels of participation, abuse of laws by governing officials, issues with the elections, and the problem is that people aren't really going to have much confidence in state institutions, and that we get into this gray zone where we're not really a democracy, we're not really a dictatorship. We call this oftentimes qualified democracy, or in the other reading for this week, we also call that a democracy with adjectives, the idea that it's authoritarian democracy or something like that, an illiberal democracy. So a pseudo-democracy, these we call these democracy with adjectives. It's kind of a democracy, but not quite. And so Carothers mentions that there's two common kinds that exist. One is called feckless pluralism. So this idea that there are some political freedoms, there are some elections, some alternation of power, but there's a corrupt leadership that just seems to be passing power back and forth, and the public isn't really engaged in the democracy. And he gives some examples of Latin America on the next page where that has happened. The other issue is what we call dominant power politics right here. This is where there are basic institutions of democracy, but really it's one group or one party that has control of power. And what happens is when there's only one group in control of power, the line between who's in power now, so between the government and the regime, or the long-standing system, tends to get blurred, and it's really, they may win power through elections, but it's always the same people. So the citizens aren't really engaged. A lot of corruption can occur, just like in feckless pluralism. So he says this is happening, common in sub-Saharan Africa, former Soviet Union, Middle East. So he says these assumptions aren't really playing out. So what does this mean then for the assumptions that we outlined earlier? So the first is this idea of being transitional, that you move from democracy to dictatorship. It's not always going to happen, that sometimes you can get elements of democracy, but then not really develop into a full liberal democracy like we'd expect. But unfortunately, we still talk like it's a transition from one to the other. In fact, and then he moves to number 2, the assumption of sort of stages of democracy don't really happen as neatly as we'd like. Some happen through really gradual liberalization rather than this opening, a big breakthrough, and then consolidation. Other times what can happen is you'll start moving in towards democracy and then start moving back. So he says really we can't keep thinking that there's going to be clear stages of democratization. The third is this idea that elections equal democracy, which they don't. Right here. That you can't necessarily solve all problems of inequality just by holding elections. Actually, elections might serve to perpetuate or intensify those inequalities. So recall we talked about last week about dictators holding elections because it's good window dressing. It makes them look good. It's some sort of pressure release that they allow the citizens to feel like they're having some sort of input. They use it to identify their support, to discourage those who don't support them. And so a lot of dictators have realized, actually, elections are a great way for me to look legitimate, but not actually be legitimate, especially if you're rigging those elections to make you always come out on top. So democracy is not always, elections are not always going to lead to democracy, even though we had this sense that they would. The next is, let's move down. The idea that democracy doesn't happen in a vacuum. and that maybe there are some preconditions. Maybe you need to have a good enough economy. Maybe you need to have some level of equality. We like to think that democracy is universal, but some cases have suggested that maybe there needs to be some sort of level, existing level of equality to exist before democracy can take hold. And then the fifth part is, and we talked about this in the other lecture, is that state building is really hard work. You can become a democracy, but that doesn't necessarily mean all of a sudden you're going to have a functioning state. And building a state can cause a lot of challenges. You can see corruption. You can see some people building that state and then holding on to power. And so this idea that democracy is going to solve everything is really a myth, because we know that building a state is hard work, and that not every country succeeds in doing that, even if they have a democracy. So right here, he summarizes some of the myths and why you should not assume these things anymore. And then he concludes by with this really good quote here that they popped out here. What is often thought of as an uneasy, precarious middle ground between full-fledged democracy and outright dictatorship is actually the most common political condition today of countries in the developing world and the post-communist world. So the idea that we should stop saying that they are in a transition phase and actually say this is a unique regime type. This idea that they're not necessarily stuck between phases, but it's actually common and it's actually here to stay. So what does this mean then for those who are interested in promoting democracy? You might think, oh dear, this is all going to be so dire. The question being, what should we be doing to promote democracy? So the first is to really help grassroots political parties develop and encourage civil society. And that's going to allow for the preconditions for democracy to really take hold and not fail so quickly. He also explains encouraging the growth of alternative centers of power. So the idea that having a variety of parties develop, supporting the development of a variety of civil society organizations, a variety of different groups that can be powerful, so you can actually have the alternation of power that's required to remain democratic. So that's a quick brush through of this article. You can go back now and add some notes or take a look at it, but I think it's a really good summary of why regime transition is the title of this week rather than democratization, because regime transitions are not always towards democracies. Sometimes it's a reversal back, and sometimes it's also a move from an authoritarian regime to what we call, a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime with adjectives, a pseudo-authoritarian regime. And I think that's the one thing, paradigm shift that we need to think about, is that this shift from democracy or from dictatorship to democracy is not always so clear-cut, and that we have to stop thinking of it as an inevitability and instead consider the fact that a lot of these alternative regime types are here to stay. All right, so this is the point where you can head over to the quiz if you've seen both halves of the video and take a look at that, and we will talk more about specific cases in class.